Good afternoon, still good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. A number of your members provide secretarial services to APPGs. What would you say are the benefits of APPG secretarial services to the House and to the wider public interest? I'll start with Mr. Herbert.
I'm chair of the Public Affairs Group in the PRCA. We represent 124 public affairs companies with about 2,000 staff, so a lot of our members are engaged in APPG activity. We strongly support the idea of APPGs and its role in parliamentary democracy, as MPs can't know everything they need to know about all subjects. We also suggest that the providing of services either commercially or pro bono through a secretariat system saves public money and public funds. We are strongly supportive of all the transparency that goes with that, and our public affairs code is more stringent perhaps than the Lobbying Act in terms of declarations of activity within the APPG system. So we think it's a valuable service to democracy and therefore a valuable service to public interest.
Mr. Gellis.
Thank you. I certainly agree with Mr. Herbert's points. I'll add that the confidence that it can give to Parliament is based on the knowledge and expertise that our members have of the parliamentary process, acting as a buffer between those that are supporters of APPGs and parliamentarians themselves. The benefit to the public, of course, is that all of our members are searchable on the Public Relations Register, which we have online, and that also comes next to a code of conduct which all members actively sign up to, and a publicly available complaints process which anyone who has any concerns about activities or behaviours of any of our members can go through. So there's confidence, I think, on both sides.
Thank you. Do you think these external secretariats, who are your members in your respective organisations, at least many of them, should be subject to any restrictions in the work that they do on behalf of the APPGs? We'll start with Mr. Gellis.
Thank you. So we have, we've got, as named contacts for APPGs, 15 members named for 18 APPGs. In terms of the restrictions that you speak about, I don't think that's necessarily the right way. I think the regulations that are in place and the rules that are in place are adequate. I think they provide a good degree of transparency. Now, I think the key concern here for us is that actually there's some quite big differences between how APPGs operate. We've talked already about the numbers of APPGs and the numbers that have been seen over the last few months in particular, and they do operate rather differently, and the rules, although applied to all of them, don't seem to necessarily be as strictly adhered to by some compared to others. Now, our members take their responsibilities towards their professional conduct in this area very seriously and will go above and beyond in terms of listing sponsors of APPGs, which is encouraged by the rules, not recommended, not required. So I don't think what we're really key to sort of...
Can I just check on that? It's not. You're saying it's not required. I would have thought it was.
No, sponsors of APPGs, so secretariats are required, obviously, to declare themselves sponsors of those APPGs. It's encouraged that they're
what are you counting as a sponsor?
Someone that provides financial benefits or benefits in kind to a secretariat to provide services to the APPG.
So you mean...
I'll read the rule out if you like. I've got it somewhere here.
What we were saying earlier, that a widget manufacturer who provides support to an APPG through the Secretariat, it's the Secretariat that has to be registered, not the individual widget manufacturer.
Yes.
Yeah, but whereas if somebody gives £10,000 to the All-Party Spain group directly, then we do have to register that.
If it's direct, absolutely.
Yes, so that's what I thought you meant by sponsors, and whereas you mean sponsors or the people who are behind the Secretariat. Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's quite okay. And I've lost my train of thought in terms of what I was saying there. But I think
I was asking specifically, do you think there should be any further restrictions from what you already know in terms of what they can do on behalf of the APPGs?
No, I don't think so. And I think the key here is that what we're looking for is greater scrutiny and greater enforcement on how APPGs are regulated. The rules are appropriate. We want to see, I think, greater scrutiny and enforcement of them.
Thank you. Mr. Herbert.
We would agree in that principle as well. If you take the widget analogy that's been used. Under the Code of Conduct and the rules that my members follow, then we would be declaring who runs the APPG, whether it's one of our members, and within that, who funds it and who funds that APPG. And that's published, as we say, quarterly on our register. So again, easily searchable on that basis. In terms of the work that's done, anything that facilitates the work of the APPG and in terms of its purposes would seem perfectly reasonable, as long as it's transparent, open, and easily discovered who's saying what about what, and in terms of who's paying for it.
Let me just play devil's advocate for a moment. You're a consultancy, a public affairs consultancy, and one of your clients comes along to you and says, well, we really want to get the law changed on X. How can we, get this discussed in Parliament? How can we... And you go, well, the best way would obviously be to set up an APPG. Let's try and find an MP who will launch an APPG. They might not be able to get the numbers of people really interested in it, but you only really need one. And theoretically, you've got to have a few people who will add their names to it. But and at the end of it, and then you would advise your client. One of the best things an APPG could do now is it could publish a report. And it will look like a parliamentary report because it's in the report of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on X. That's a sort of rather cynical and sceptical way of how this might work, but it does feel a bit sometimes as if that's what's actually happening. Is that fair or manifestly unfair? Or do you not recognise that any public affairs consultancy would ever advise anybody to set up an APPG?
Our public affairs companies also advise to set up an APPG because if the purpose is to inform and educate, so take your legislative example, the positives and the negatives of legislation and the impacts and unintended consequences of legislation, then communicating that through an APPG might be a perfectly legitimate way of lobbying. But we're very clear that it's very clear who's saying what about that. So the organisation, the analogy there, comes forward and says we want to change the law in this. Everyone can see that that's who's behind this, and that's who's helping sponsor the report that then says whatever the report says.
Yeah, thank you. I think the 2013-2014 report from the previous committee, made the point that the APPGs on a particularly good route from improper lobbying is what they called it. I don't work for a public relations consultancy. I think it's a particular. It's one way of a lobbying campaign. That certainly wouldn't be the only tactic I would advise. I agree completely with Mr. Herbert's point about the increase of transparency being required. I think the point was made earlier by Transparency International, which I know you agree with, Chair, about the information that's on the Parliament website is all there. The accessibility and the story that it tells, and the ability to sort of actually access what that means, I think, is a very different situation. So I think it's really about making sure that we can be as transparent as possible. We had the registrar earlier. I think a key to this is an expansion of the lobbying register. As the registrar himself said, it's rather narrow in its definition of what is defined by the law as lobbying. It's consultant lobbying to particular to ministers or permanent secretaries. Both bodies who've been calling for a long time for this to be expanded to cover all lobbying activities, so we have a good register of lobbying activity. Whoever's doing it, that could be officers of APPGs as well, of course.
Why has the number gone up so dramatically in the last 2 years?
Well, the answer is I don't know, but I would say that in terms of public affairs consultancy support, I don't think that's gone up. I think again previously there was a number about 15% of APPGs were provided external support from public affairs companies at around 15%. With the number of groups that have gone up, I don't think the number of consultancy support has necessarily gone up. I guess there is just a lot of interesting issues to discuss in Parliament, and maybe they're seen as an interesting way to. I mean, they're certainly a very valuable way, and we certainly see value in them. So hopefully parliamentarians also recognise that value.
Sure. Just to pick up on what Mr. Herbert said about transparency. I haven't had the benefit of looking at the APPG reports yet, but I will have a look at some. You say it will be published who's the sponsor. Is that published in the report, or will it be published in your members' register?
The Public Affairs Board register, which we publish on a quarterly basis.
Yeah. But if you publish a report, it wouldn't necessarily be in the report. Who sponsors
No,
it?
the register is published online on a quarterly basis, and all our members make a return on a quarterly basis, declaring not just APPG activity, but every member of the organisation that's involved in lobbying is named.
No, I accept that. My point is, you talked about a report. Coming back to Chris's example, a way to influence. You said get informed would be the publication of a report, which is fine. But would the sponsors of that report be published in the report, or would it be published as an all-party APPG?
That would be a matter for the APPG to decide themselves.
So the transparency isn't really there. You'll have to go back to your member register to find out who's involved in that.
You'd have to go through the member register to see who was supporting that APPG.
Yeah.
But that's a matter for the APPG themselves about governance on that side. And we would suggest that as a ethical and transparent lobbyist and an ethical and transparent public affairs practitioner, then you should be declaring either in reports or on the register who's involved in whatever the production is.
So if we did a trawl of APPG reports in general, do you think we would find, given your members are involved in that there would be open publication of who's sponsoring this activity?
I don't know, so I'm not familiar with all the reports that are produced out of the 600 APPGs.
Bernard.
Sorry, it's going to sound rather an aggressive question, but I really mean it in a kind way. How concerned are you about the public reputation of your industry?
Very concerned. We take it very seriously, and we take the ethics and transparency of what we do very seriously.
So if a report produced by an APG is being confused with a report produced by a proper parliamentary committee, how concerned are you about that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, this is. I mean, what basically happens is all-party groups produce reports, and they are reported. They are confused very often by political commentators to be some kind of official utterance of Parliament, like a select committee. I mean, the BBC has the habit of introducing a select committee report, saying a group of MPs has reported that, and later in the bulletin they might actually tell you which select committee it is. But they will report an APPG in the same way a group of MPs, or an all-party group of MPs. You know, and if a lobbying company or a public affairs consultancy is behind that, how much do you think the reputation of your industry is compromised by what looks like covert lobbying? Well, I'm amazed at or confused about it.
My response to that would be the way the activities of Parliament are reported and the way that the activities of the lobbying industry are reported often leave quite a lot to be desired. And our engagement with journalism on that side helps, we hope, to promote a better understanding of lobbying.
Right, well,
I understand the shorthand of how journalists write about things. I consider anything that where there's a confusion or a potential confusion is something that we need to address. I'm not quite sure how, as an organisation, or how APPGs would actually seek to achieve that.
That's fine. So what measures do you think Parliament should take which would actually protect and enhance the reputation of your industry from being misconstrued in the way that it is sometimes misconstrued? What should we do about it?
The way that APPGs are presented on a parliamentary basis is perhaps an area to consider on that front.
I mean, we could, for example, require that any APPG that produces a report says in very large letters on the front.
We do.
We do.
It doesn't have to say very large letters, but we do have to. It does have to say on the front of the report.
It should not be coloured green, and it should not. It's not allowed to carry the report colours, or is it? I can't remember. But what? I mean, how concerned are you that we should take other measures to make clear this separation between what all-party groups do and what select committees do? Shouldn't you be concerned? Would you give it some thought?
We'll give that some thought. It's not something we've considered before.
No,
we'll respond back to you on that.
Yeah, but I mean, many of your members have considered it to be in their interest to sponsor all-party parliamentary groups. I think as the industry body you might want to reflect on how this looks to protect the reputation of your members.
Could I add some points to that?
Yeah, sure, go on, Mr. Gillis.
Yeah, sure.
Would you like me to add some points to that? I would just say that, I mean, I think there is the issue about the public understanding of APPGs as informal groups certainly is an issue, obviously, for this side rather than for us. We commissioned a survey last week, and 1 in 10 members of the public of 2,000 surveyed said they had any idea what an APPG is, let alone its role or purpose. We have to also understand that there is APPGs, in their informality, which is obviously very valuable in separating them from the executive, are part of the fabric of this institution, and therefore they have got a degree of authority and reputation. In terms of your specific question about what can Parliament do to help increase, if you like, the accusation that the public affairs...
Well, to strengthen public confidence in what's going on.
Well, very simply, I would suggest, well, there's a few areas of transparency, in particular areas within APPG specifically, but overall it goes back to the lobbying register. As I say, the lobbying register is an incredibly narrowly defined register of a particular number of lobbyists. It's up to us as trade, as industry bodies, to provide our members with the opportunity to be transparent. And actually, I'd say that's quite damning. The Parliament doesn't legislate for that. So we want to see a widening of the lobbying register. We need a lobbying register that captures activity rather than just a small number of lobbyists.
Well, we all know what the problem is. We all know what lobbying is. But trying to define lobbying in law is extraordinarily difficult without catching a whole lot of other perfectly legitimate activities.
But for instance, it's been put to me by some quite senior members of the House that we should be saying no secretariat can be provided by a commercial organisation, or that all secretariats have to be done in-house by members' offices.
I think bringing rules like that in compromises the informality of the groups. For a start, it's very difficult to make that and to get the level of support for a number of APPGs that they're currently getting. As I explained at the very beginning, the benefit to the public and to Parliament of having consultancies provide secretarial support is there because of our code of conduct and because of the clear independent complaints process that we operate. We are very clear, and we would love to see all lobbyists and public affairs consultancies sign up to a code of conduct and to be held to the same level of scrutiny that our respective members are.
I mean, other countries have friendship groups which are appointed by the House, by the respective House, not just anybody who feels like turning up. But anyway.
I'm not sure how removing commercial interests actually helps transparency or visibility on this, though, because then what you potentially lead to is much more, as we said earlier, pro bono activity, benefiting the kind of activity, which is harder to notice and harder to follow through a transparency process. The focus on public affairs agencies providing sectoral services seems obtuse in an area where what we're looking at is broader transparency from an industry that is actually more transparent than in some cases, as we've said earlier, Parliament itself in this respect.
I suppose the thing that's rattling in my head is that sometimes it just feels as if the driving force for these things is not the member and the member's interest, it's a commercial interest from outside. And that somehow, when it gets the imprimatur of parliamentary on it, that's the bit that seems awry. And I was a lobbyist for the BBC. I'm in favour of lobbying. I think it's a perfectly legitimate, honourable career. But I still worry about where we're at. Sorry, Bernard.
How practical would it be for the public affairs consultancy involved to make it clear on behalf of which clients they are acting in respect of that all-party group? Because presumably the public affairs consultancy wouldn't be doing it out of altruism, it would be doing it because it's being encouraged to do it by a client or a number of clients.
We already do that.
Right.
We already declare that on our register.
You clear it on your register, but would it help if the all-party parliamentary group was required to make that declaration more explicit?
That would be a reasonable connection.
Okay. Can you just describe, or sort of set out, what is the potential for conflicts of interest between the public interest and the private interest of a secretariat, or the client funding the secretariat, as you see it? What are the potential conflicts of interest?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important that the parliamentarians remain connected to the outside world through their interests, through their experiences. CIPR contributed to a 2018 report from the Committee on Standards and Public Life on MPs' outside interests, where we made that point. There were 12 recommendations in that report, including to the committee, that a review of the rules on register of interest is looked at, which we certainly would welcome. Again, I think it ultimately comes down to the issue of transparency, and making sure that your point earlier about the fact that some sponsors, the point that you made earlier about sponsors not having to be declared, I think that's a very good point. Some consultancies proactively do that on the register, on the APPG register, but it's not consistent enough, and the level of detail that is provided across the board isn't consistent enough. There has to be some balance between an MP's outside interest and where the public interest is, and if there's a conflict in that, I think there needs to be stronger rules around that, certainly. There are very few, the point I made earlier about the sort of 15% or so of secretarial support being provided by consultancy suggests that it's not a significant commercial opportunity for too many agencies. If it was, we'd see that number be significantly higher. But we have had members raise concerns about the fact that some have used this as business development opportunities. That's not, however, limited just to public affairs consultancies. I was sent a proposal that a member received from a secretariat of an APPG, which didn't involve a consultancy, where there were different bands of sponsorship, and the top band was £100,000 for 2 years. Now, the concern we have with that isn't necessarily about the figure itself or what the APPG gets from that, although that wasn't clear. What was very clear was the level of access that the sponsor would receive. But actually, there's 2 points. A is that the sponsor isn't required to be declared, as I mentioned earlier. B, there's no indication that officers would have any idea about this level of sponsorship being provided, or any level of sponsorship being provided at all. So there are certainly some areas that need to be tightened up.
Well, it's a very, very full answer, but if I can just play back to you what I think you said in answer to my question, which was when I said what are the potential conflicts of interest. You mentioned 2 things. One is that it should be that it actually is a vehicle for advancing the commercial interests of the secretariat, the person sponsoring the secretariat.
And that's the case in very few examples.
Well, but I would be surprised. I can't think of any other reason a commercial organisation or a charity would want to do it unless they were advancing the interests of their organisation, or a trade union. I mean, I can't think of why they would do it.
To advance
Otherwise, they're misappropriating the funds of their organisation for some personal interest of the directors or something. I mean, let's be realistic. But you say it's very rare. Okay, but the other item you mentioned, what was it? It is that. Sorry.
While you're thinking about that, can I just ask about the £100,000 instance that you gave, because I didn't understand.
Cash for access. That's what it was.
Oh, sorry.
You said cash for access. So let's just look at that for a minute. How much access does a public affairs consultancy or a commercial organisation get by having by sponsoring an all-party secretariat? I mean, in your experience, and how serious is that?
It differs between different groups.
But it is cash for access, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is in a large number of organisations.
But you just said 100,000. That gets much more access.
And that wasn't a consultancy actually that was supplying that. But what we don't want to see, and this is why the rules need to be tightened up and enforced, and there needs to be greater scrutiny, is actually having having a pay-to-play system around. And we need to see, and there does need to be a level of responsibility from the officers themselves to make sure that the right voices and competing voices are taking part in that conversation, not just those that can afford to.
Forgive me, I'll come to you in just a second. But okay, we've identified 2 areas of conflict. How should that be addressed?
Well, I think that certainly needs to be. There needs to be tougher rules, from the registrar's office to basically scrutinise these points. The number of groups that have risen in the last few years, certainly since the 2013-14 report, I don't think it's been reflected in the office's infrastructure or resources. So there certainly needs to be greater scrutiny on that.
So, same question. Thank you very much, by the way. Same question. What exactly are the conflicts, and how should they be addressed?
I disagree entirely with the cash for access comment. Anyone who's running a secretariat has the same access, whether they're a commercial organisation, whether they're a charity, whether they're providing their services free of charge. I think the dissonance is between the activities and the reasons and purpose of the APPG, potentially, and how that is communicated and how that is funded, and the requirement for the funding on that basis.
So you're making a very important point here, which I think is really important. It's very often the members of an APPG already have a deep interest in a particular topic, which they want to advance, and therefore, I mean, I can attest to this. You see it as an opportunity to advance something you believe in, and you're finding some sympathetic organisation to help you advance.
When the driving force is that way around, yeah.
When the driving force is that way around, and we wouldn't want to frustrate that.
Not at all.
Yeah,
that's a positive aspect.
I think but how do we make the distinction between the two?
And I guess it's a governance issue. We as an industry can do as much as we can in terms of being open and transparent and declaring who's involved and what's involved. But there's an element for members to then take control and say, in terms of how this works and how we engage with outside organisations, whoever they may be, who help us provide the secretariat and the facilities to do the work to pursue this interest.
Let's take an example. There was an all-party group, and I can't remember what it was called, that was very keen with the destruction of personal data and confidential information, that members of Parliament and organisations should be encouraged to destroy data they didn't bring to help, which is, of course, to comply with the data protection regime. The all-party group was sponsored by a manufacturer of paper shredders. How does that sit? How does that feel? Is that okay?
Providing everybody knows that it's sponsored by a member who makes paper shredders, then that seems perfectly reasonable. There's nothing wrong with a commercial organisation putting forward a point of view to Parliament and to parliamentarians.
Yeah, but using I think the issue is, I think I'd go back to the driving forces. Where's the driving force for all of this coming from? And being transparent about that is quite difficult. Can I just ask?
Thanks very much.
Sorry, Sven.
Okay.
And I'm aware, in a way, Aaron, we've asked some of your questions, but I'll come on. Yeah, but just one quick question. Parliamentary email accounts apparently are provided to quite a number of secretariats. Do you know how many?
I don't.
I think it'd be good if we could find that out. I'm looking to the registrar. And secondly, parliamentary passes, I know, are quite often provided to secretariats. Do you know how many?
We recently went through a trawl of who holds parliamentary passes in association with Transparency International. A number of APPGs did come up on that. Our views, as my colleague here, is similar. We take a very strong line on parliamentary passes for anybody who's not actively involved in the function of Parliament. We don't allow that. We don't allow members to have parliamentary passes. There's no requirement for them to have those.
But it does happen, doesn't it?
It does, and that's again it's a matter we've raised with the parliamentary authorities.
And you can imagine if the driving force for setting up the APPG is from outside, from a commercial interest, and then they end up with a pass for Parliament, that's bingo, isn't it? I mean, that is a really...
And again, let's be very clear, anyone who is doing that through an APPG would not be doing that through either a CIPR or a PRCA membership. Our Code of Conduct, both our Code of Professional Conduct and our Public Affairs Code, do not allow such activity.
There are bad apples everywhere. Aaron.
Sorry, Aaron.
My questions, to be fair, my questions have been covered because we talked about transparency and funding, and I can glean from other discussions. Thank you.
Okay.
No, it's fine.
He's a very naughty boy. But Michael's got his hand up, and then we'll come to Tammy. Michael.
Both of you in your submissions made great play about the ethical standards of membership and talk about the code of conduct and the self-regulatory mechanisms. Just a matter of interest, how many of your members have been subject to discipline, say within the last 2 years, for failure to adhere to that code? And any particular examples with regard to the activities in relation to APPGs?
None in relation to APPGs, and with the exact figure in terms of how many have actually been stripped of their membership in the last 2 years, it's been 1. we have obviously received complaints, and they've been dealt with sort of amicably in many examples, but one has been stripped of membership and 0 complaints about any APPG activity.
And Mr. Herbert, you're over?
I'm not aware of any complaints regarding our members
So
of APPG activity.
that's because all your members adhere to the highest ethical standards, or is it because the levels of inquiry into their behaviour is weak?
We take our reporting and recording and responses to our register extremely seriously, and so as an organisation we will challenge internally where we think or perceive there may be some problems there. The opportunity to complain or raise issues about any of our members is open to anyone at any time. The PRCA has a very strong record of dealing robustly with membership infractions in its code of conduct.
But just to be clear, how many members are in your organisation?
How many members?
Yeah.
There are throughout the world, over 35,000.
In the UK?
In the UK, 124 organisations in the Public Affairs Board.
So we're different. We have individual members rather than organisations. We have around 10,000 individual members.
So out of all of that number, one...
So collectively across, we have about 2,500 members involved in public affairs activities.
Well, that makes it worse. One has been found guilty of inappropriate behaviour.
Your question earlier about whether it's our members' reputable behaviour, our members do take their professional conduct very seriously. They sign up to the code of conduct both on joining and upon renewing membership. We do write to all new MPs. We've produced a guide to professional lobbying, which we obviously send to members, but also we've written to all new MPs over the last 2, maybe 3 elections. And that includes specific behaviours and activities that you should expect from a professional lobbyist, whether they're a member or not, and how to make a complaint.
Well, I have no doubt about that, but the problem is with policies, saying it does not make it so. And simply because policies are in place doesn't mean they're going to be implemented in practice. And the fact that only one member, I mean, we're hearing concerns about inappropriate activity in relation to lobbying, but yet only one member has been disciplined for inappropriate activity. I just wonder, is there dissonance in relation to that? I'm not suggesting there is a problem, but I just wonder, is there dissonance?
Well, from our perspective, we run professional training for all our members, not just broadly on the public affairs code, but on the ethics of the public relations and public affairs industry per se. One of the issues is obviously new entrants into companies, new entrants into members, teaching again, and building the ethical view at the start of that. And we champion that by taking a very firm line on, as we have done throughout recent months, on any kind of perceived lobbying scandals that have taken place. And the activities of former ministers and former prime ministers have featured quite significantly in that, less so the activities of what we would consider to be professional public affairs practitioners.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Gellis, I did ask you to repeat this thing about the £100,000 case, because I think it's something that the Speaker has referred to me about as well, but I don't quite understand it, and I don't know who the person is that this refers to.
No, sure, I'll clarify. So a member of ours received a proposal from a secretariat to sponsor an APPG. That proposal has 3 tiers of sponsorship, all for 2 years level of sponsorship. The platinum, as it's called, tier, which is the top tier, was £100,000. It went down, I think, to then 50 and possibly 20. I have that. I have it on email. As I say, the concern that we have, and each tier included what.
When was this?
This was over the last few months, over the last couple of months, I think.
And what APPG is this?
It was the APPG on longevity, and as I say, we have no concern particularly about that individual APPG. The concern is about what level of reporting needs to happen.
So I'm feeling stupid. Does everybody else understand this and I don't? So no, everybody else is shaking their heads as well. So somebody was proposing is there already this APPG? It exists, does it?
It exists, and there's a secretariat.
Right.
And the secretariat is looking for financial sponsors to give money to essentially attend meetings and be part of.
To attend meetings.
To attend
you had to pay to
APPGs.
attend meetings.
Well, you don't have to pay to attend, but the sponsorship included access to meetings.
I mean, that's quite high up there on the badness register, isn't it?
And the different tiers included the number of meetings you could attend as well.
Can you provide us with the kind of chapter and verse on this? Because I think we might want to ask the individuals concerned to come and explain their position. Is that all right?
Yeah, I've got it to send. Yeah, I'll send it
Okay,
to
thanks
the
very much.
office. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to understand, and I'd be very interested to see the proposal. So this money would be used to effectively pay the Secretariat. Is that what the sponsorship is for?
It appears that way, yes. It answers the question about sort of commercial interests of consultancies. And, you know, this is a clear, to me, reason why there needs to be some greater level of transparency in terms of the sponsors that I talked about earlier on. But yes, it looks like the Secretariat would then allow that money to be used for different levels of access to the APPG.
It's an awful lot of money to spend on the Secretariat for an APPG, but anyway. But thanks very much. Tammy, and then we're on the home straight, I think.
Thank you. So I think most of what I was going to ask has been covered, apart from some specifics around the Secretariat and the APP chair. I just wondered if you think the current rules make it clear what is the responsibility of the Secretariat and what is the responsibility of the chair?
Yeah, I don't think we have any particular issues with that. But again, we're back to the same conversation we had earlier. There are APPGs of varying quality, and the definition of purpose and drive behind some of them may be more specific than others.
Some members have raised concerns that that line between where the role of an officer stops and the role of the Secretariat begins is blurred, and that there isn't a consistent approach. The guidance that exists appears to be written towards officers of APPGs rather than secretarial support. It's been suggested by some members that actually clear guidance specifically for Secretariat support would be beneficial. CRPL would be very happy to work with the office to produce something like that as well. So there is some concern that there is some confusion that exists.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're grateful to both of you. It would be great if you've got anything you want to add to send that in writing to us, and in particular on this case, I think we'd like to sort of dig into that a bit more to see whether that reveals anything that we need to work on. But with that, order, thank you very much. That's the end of the public evidence session. Can I just ask colleagues to stay